First of all, thanks so much for the invitation. It's an honor and a great pleasure, and I'm grateful to Manfred. I'll try to get through quite a lot of data here. So if you come from the theoretical side and the data stuff seems a little unclear, don't hesitate to just ask. If you come more from the experimental background and have never thought about or heard about assertion or the literature on it, also don't hesitate to just ask a question. So the topic is norms of assertion for humans. On the one hand, what do we expect from one another when we communicate information, and how do these expectations or norms match up to our new AI-driven friends who increasingly become our interlocutors. An assertion is standardly considered in the literature. I mean, there's a bit of a dispute, as always when philosophers sit at the same table and talk about the same notion. Roughly, an assertion is a speech act, so something we do, and what we do with it is we exchange information or alleged information. Assertions, it is hypothesized, are governed by norms. Norms are conventional rules, and sometimes we are in a position to say something if we adhere to the norm or if we fulfill the norm or the rule, and sometimes we are not. This, at least, is perhaps the orthodox assumption. Now, there are different, in the literature, especially in the philosophical literature, on assertion, which goes back several decades, there are different candidates for norms of assertion. So the general question is, when is it appropriate for a speaker to assert a certain proposition P? You might think that, your interlocutor or the speaker can only say that P if they know that P. So that would be a very demanding norm or rule. Alternatively, you could say, well, it's fine as long as P is true. In that case, you don't necessarily require justification on the speaker's behalf. Or else you might be a little bit more relaxed and say, look, knowledge and truth are very demanding standards. It might be okay to say that P if you have good reasons to hold that P. But that, of course, would be consistent with P being false. Or else you could say, no, I mean, say whatever you believe, as long as you don't lie in my face, as long as you don't have an intention to deceive me, it's fine. If you believe that P, you can say that P. So if you think about this, what we get is more or less, and this is sort of a basic model from microeconomics, we get this kind of trade-off, or as I call it, a budget constraint, where we have, where we're sort of trading off the quantity of warranted assertions for the quality of said assertions. And you could say, if mere belief is the norm, then basically every assertion where you actually believe what you say is warranted, and that makes for a lot of warranted assertions. On the other hand, for instance, if it's truth, it would be fewer assertions that are warranted. Or, if you go down the line, knowledge and certainty and whatnot. I mean, if you have to be absolutely certain that P in order to be in a position to say that P, then I think we wouldn't really say very much, or we would constantly have to recur to, constructions invoking epistemic models such as might or probably or something else, where we always hedge our bets. Once you have this trade-off, what you can do is you can sort of draw an indifference curve and say a species might be indifferent between giving up a bit of quantity for some more quality. And to start with something that has neither anything to do with humans or robots, I think this can sort of be meaningfully discussed also with regards to other species. Here, for instance, is a beautiful bird called willow-tit, 70% of whose predator calls are false. So these birds communicate and they say, look, there's a predator that could be a cat or an eagle or something else. Astonishingly, more than half of these predator calls are false. So if you think there's nothing, there is no, so we're assuming cooperative communication, you might, for instance, say, look, whenever the willow tit sees like a really nice bit of food, he shouts eagle, so that the other willow tits don't come and like take the food. That would be a matter of deception or of lying. But let's assume that, I don't know whether that's investigated, but let's assume that these are cooperative assertions, and that the willow tit does not lie intentionally with its predator calls. Then you could say, on this quasi microeconomic model of assertion, it doesn't have to be a true belief. It certainly doesn't have to be certainty or knowledge or something. Probably the norm of assertion for predator calls amongst willow tits is somewhere between mere belief and true belief. Perhaps it has to be justified. Maybe it doesn't even have to be justified, And once you think about it, of course, this makes a lot of sense, because it's better to be safe than sorry. Like probably the the kind of reproach one bird can make to the other for saying something that wasn't perfectly justified, or they didn't know, or they weren't certain about, isn't as important if someone has just died. Then when you sort of set a low standard of assertion and say, okay, whenever I have a bit of a reason to assume that there's a cat in the bush, I call predator. Okay. The question for the next 35 minutes or so is, where in this model can we locate the human norm of assertion? And there are two, there's one orthodox position held by the majority of philosophers, in particular Timothy Williamson, who says, look, you are in a position to say that P if you know that P, and you shouldn't say that P if you don't know that P. And there is an alternative position that has, had a bit of there is an alternative position that is, I would say, becoming more popular. And for instance, Neri Marsili and Alex Wiegmann, but also my colleague Kevin Reuter, Peter Brössel, lots of younger researchers think that it makes perhaps more sense to say that you can assert that P if your belief is justified. And this has sort of already the broad philosophical advantage that many of our assertions are okay and not most of them would be not okay. I'm going to say a little bit about why we think, and I include Alex Wiegmann's research in this, of course, why we think that human assertion is justified belief rather than something more demanding, such as truth or knowledge, or possibly certainty. There are even people around who say you have to be certain at P. And then I'll present some new research on what we expect from our new friends. So the first question is, what is the norm of assertion in human-human interaction? And then we'll take that same question from human-human to human-robot interaction. So take a first experiment in which I try to make a case for the claim that the norm of assertion amongst humans is justified belief. Here's a scenario. So what I usually do in these cases is I devise a scenario that has all the relevant properties that are at stake in the philosophical debate. I present that to people and ask them whether someone can say something. Okay, so the situation is the following. I have to move this. Okay, the airport help desk is staffed by Ken. A woman asks Ken at which gate the flight to Paris leaves. Ken checks the database and says the flight leaves from gate 24. This is a perfectly ordinary situation. We can expect cooperative behavior in such a case. So now consider the first kind of vignette, which then specifies that the database, which is used by Ken, is malfunctioning in bits or in parts, but this doesn't affect the Paris flight. And the flight leaves from gate 24. So since Ken uses a reliable mechanism to find out, what he's supposed to say, we would probably think that his belief is justified. And since what he says is true, it's also a true belief. If he uses the database and it is also malfunctioning, and this does affect the Paris flight, then we would still say, look, I mean, he used a reliable mechanism or reliable epistemic source to justify his claim. But in this case, it was sort of pretty unlucky. And, you know, the belief and also the assertion turns out false. So we have a justified false belief. And let's contrast this with a case where neither justification nor truth are given. So let's say Ken can't find the flight in the database, but, you know, like he takes a guess, or like he has a feeling that it might leave from gate 24, and it does indeed leave from gate 24. So we have an unjustified and true belief. Okay, so what we're doing here is we are selectively manipulating the two features of interest, namely justification and truth. So people get one of the three scenarios, only one, and they get to answer three questions. First of all, do you think it was appropriate for Ken to say P? I think in certain experiments, I also asked them whether he should say that P. Secondly, do you think Ken was justified in believing P? This is a manipulation check because we manipulate justification. And also we want to understand whether people understand the scenario correctly, and was P true, which is another manipulation check. So here we have the results. I recruited about 152 participants, kicked a few out who were inattentive, which left 120. And for the justified true belief, you know, exactly 100% said that the belief was true. So they correctly judged the situation in this regard. They also considered looking at the database a good means of justification for the belief. And unsurprisingly, in this case, this is sort of the control condition. They said, by and large, nearly everyone said, you know, Ken can say this. Let's have a look at the justified false belief condition here. We said, okay, it's a matter of a false belief. The plane doesn't leave from gate 24 as said, but from gate 13. So hardly anyone considers it true, which is fine. People by and large, or nearly everyone, 97% or so, considered the belief justified, and nearly everyone, I don't know, like 78% or so, considered the claim assertable. So what we have here is quite powerful evidence that truth is not a necessary condition for assertability. And if truth isn't a necessary condition for assertability, the knowledge norm is, of course, also out of the window, because knowledge entails truth. You can't know something that is false. How about the unjustified true belief? Why do we have this extra scenario? It's basically a matter of checking, you know, is justification as important or more important than truth? And what about the truth picture? And here you see, you know, basically everyone understands that when Ken sort of, you know, he can't find the flight in the list, but he has a feeling that it leaves from gate 24. It does indeed leave from gate 24. He says it leaves from gate 24. Everyone understands that this is true, but that he said it without reason. And even though it is true, he's not supposed to say it. Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely, yeah.
In the instruction, was it said whether the flight, the person in the desk whether they know that the database is malfunctioning, or they didn't know?
They do not know it.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Good. Yeah, and just whenever something is unclear, please ask. So what does this first experiment show as regards our question as to when it is appropriate for a speaker to assert a certain proposition P? Well, it certainly shows that just in virtue of being true, you know, you do not have to assert it, because if it's not justified, you don't have the right to assert it. So truth can't be the norm of assertion. Therefore, knowledge, which is more demanding, which is at least truth plus justification, cannot be the norm of assertion either. On the other hand, even if the claim is false, yet justified, you are in a position to assert it. So we have preliminary evidence that, the human norm of assertion is justified belief. It's certainly not knowledge. It's certainly not justified true belief, because as we saw, you can say something if it's false yet justified. I replicated this across different cultures in a recent paper. So there, instead of like doing the whole thing in one study, I said, let's first look at the two accounts that require truth, that say the norm of assertion is truth or something more demanding, truth plus justification plus X, which amounts to knowledge. So let's contrast a situation in which a claim is justified and true on the one hand and justified and false on the other. And then depending on which of the two, responses receive more support, we can dig more into more basic accounts that go beyond factivity only. So consider a situation in which I'm not going to go into detail here because I want to get to the robots, but I want to show some cross-cultural data here. Consider a situation again in which a speaker has good grounds for a certain proposition that P. And again, sort of in the one case, P is indeed true, in the other one, P is false. Now, if you hold that the norm of assertion is factive, that it is truth or something more demanding involving truth, such as knowledge, you would predict that in scenario 1, people say, yes, it's assertable, and in scenario 2, it's not assertable because it's not true. And this time I recruited about 500 participants from the US, Germany, and Japan, because I thought, look, there might be something interesting, especially in this comparison between the US and an Asian culture. And consistent with the previous results, what we get is that, if a person has good reason to believe a certain proposition P and the proposition is true, everyone says it is true and it is assertable, okay? In the other case where the justified belief is false, people recognize it as false, okay? This is basically the manipulation check. And about 3 in 4 people still say, yes, it's assertable, presumably because it is justified, okay? So this holds for the US, Germany and Japan. And as you can see from the error bars, there is no significant difference across cultures. So the norm of assertion being just, like in this case, not being factive seems to be a first interesting cross-cultural finding. So we see, okay, truth is not required, which means the truth norm and the knowledge norm are basically out of the window. Now you can ask, well, does the belief even have to be justified, or can you maybe just say whatever you believe, And so I ran a second experiment in which a certain person believes P, and in the one case, he has good evidence for P, therefore his belief is justified. And in the other case, he does not have good evidence for P, a bit like having a hunch, taking a wild guess kind of thing, like at the airport scenario. And I asked people, should the speaker say P? And again, I recruited participants from the US, Germany, and Japan. And what you see here is that when you have such a claim, people understand that in the justified condition, it was justified. This is the manipulation check. And if it is justified or perceived as justified, people say it is assertable. If, on the other hand, the speaker has poor evidence, people did understand the scenario as intended. They said, he wasn't really justified in believing such and such, but nonetheless, he believed it, which was also checked. And then they say, he shouldn't say it, presumably because it was not justified. So as regards the norm of human assertion, we have converging findings, and this is not only me who finds this these kinds of results. Alex was present here in his very interesting recent cognition paper, for instance, jointly authored with Neri Marsili, also finds evidence consistent with this kind of view, and so do Kevin Reuter and Peter Brössel. Okay, now we turn to robot assertion. Recall this Ken at the airport experiment, and let's use the exact same vignette, but substitute the human agent for a robot agent. And you might think this is sort of like a science fiction scenario and so forth, but I've read that in certain Japanese hotels or like a tourism offices or whatnot, people are already using embodied AI-driven systems, which tell you where the theme park is or how to check into your hotel room and things like that. So again, we have, just to recall, we have this airport scenario. The help desk is staffed by Ken. A woman asks Ken at which gate the flight to Paris leaves. In the one case, you have a justified true belief. In the second vignette, you have a justified false belief. And in the third case, you have an unjustified true belief, or a belief which accidentally or like luckily turns out true. And in this case, whereas the human scenario read, the information desk is staffed by Ken, an experienced service employee who has been working at the airport for many years. In the robot scenario, it read, the information desk is staffed by Ken, a service robot equipped with artificial intelligence, which is fully capable of taking independent decisions. Okay, so here are the data for the, and of course these were asked, to what extent is Ken just, like, to what extent do you agree, not to what extent do you agree, yes or no, that Ken can say the flight to Paris leaves at gate 24. Expectedly, if there is a justified true belief, people recognize it as true and justified, and they say the robot, should say it, or it's appropriate for the robot to say it. If, on the other hand, there is a true unjustified belief, hardly anyone thinks the robot should say P. Okay, this is like in the human condition. Here comes the surprise. If the claim is false, yet justified and perceived as justified, we remember from the, the human rating for assertability was at about 78% or something. In this case, it's, I think, below 50%. Okay. So whereas for a human being, it seems to be appropriate to voice a justified yet false belief, for a robot, justification only does not suffice. On the other hand, truth only does not suffice either. So here are the two results for human and robot in direct comparison. If there's a justified true belief, in any case, I mean, this difference presumably is significant, I don't know. But even if it is, it doesn't really much matter because 4 in 5 people think the robot or the human being should say whatever is justified and true. If it's unjustified yet true, the human and the robot also are in a similar boat. Neither should say it. If it's false, but the belief was acquired via a reliable mechanism, or for good reasons, if you want, or is justified, as I put it here, the human can say it, but the robot cannot. Okay. So as to our question, when is it appropriate for a robot to assert that P? Truth by itself, like for the human being, is insufficient. Justification, unlike for the human being by itself, is also insufficient. And we only really get, significantly above the midpoint, if you want, for justified and true beliefs. So it seems that in our little diagram, that the norm of assertion for robots is considerably more demanding for robots than for human beings. Okay. Which means that, I mean, as long, I don't know how much more justified and sort of how much more probable it is that that robots deliver more justified and true beliefs. But if sort of the probability is roughly the same as for human beings, then in principle robots are less often in a position to make an acceptable assertion. So I attempted to replicate this finding with a different design in a different scenario. In this case, we have, it's also like one of those cooperative situations. Ken works at the Dartmouth Tourist Center. Sally wants to know where the post office is. Ken says the post office is on Church Street. In the one case, the post office was always on Church Street, so there's good reason to say it is, or to believe and say that it is on Church Street, and it still is. So this is sort of the justified true belief, everything is on track. In the justified false belief, condition, the post office was always there, but this very morning it moved to a different location. Okay, so it's a little unlucky. So it's false, but nonetheless, I mean, if it has been there for the last 4 or 5 years, then we would presumably say that the speaker has good reason to believe that it is still there. And in the third case, the post office was always somewhere else. So whatever inspires the belief of Ken is probably a little bit off track. So we would imagine that what he says is unjustified. But it's all, there's a bit of a lucky accident going on. Unbeknownst to Ken, the office moved to precisely that location where Ken puts it. Okay. And it's specified, you might go, but maybe he knows it, but it was specified in the scenario that he hasn't heard about this move of the post office. Okay. In this case, I used a different methodology rather than a yes/no forced choice mechanism. I used a 7-point Likert scale and asked people to what extent do you agree or disagree with the following claims. 1 completely disagree, 7 completely agree. It was appropriate for Ken to say that P. This is sort of the assertability question. Second, Ken knew that P. This is a manipulation check for the control condition. Ken's belief that P was justified. This is what we manipulate in all 3 different scenarios, and P is true. So we have 3 different manipulation checks. And the target question, of course, is the degree to which people deem it appropriate for Ken to say that P. So how does this work? For instance, for the assertability question, when the bar is high, in the higher echelons of the scale, 5, 6, or 7, there is agreement with the claim that P is assertable. And if it's low, there would be disagreement with the claim that P is assertable. So expectedly, both for the robot and the human, for the justified true belief condition, people say, yes, I absolutely agree that the robot or the human being is in a position to say this, or that it is appropriate for them to say that P. In the unjustified true belief condition, so, the case where the agent, be it the robot or the human, doesn't really have much reason to say that P. But there's this fortunate accident that the post office just moves into the hypothesized location, sort of a lucky accident kind of situation. People say, they can sort of say it, and this is significantly above the midpoint, but you see that we are way below the kind of ceiling rating which we have for justified true belief. Interestingly, as for justified true belief, in the case of unjustified true belief 2, there is no significant difference between the robot and the human. And this is the exciting finding which replicates the data from the previous experiment with a different methodology. You see that when the speaker is justified, even though he says something false and is a human, people say, yes, he can say that. It's appropriate for him to say that. But when it's a robot, they say, no, that does not suffice. Or at least there is a significant difference, and you see that the effect is pretty large. So it's close to 0.9. Okay. And what you can then do is you can investigate this a little further and see whether the relationship between scenario, the 3 different types of vignettes, and assertability is mediated by justification and truth. And as you would expect for the human scenario, justification is a significant and near complete mediator. You see that the impact of scenario on assertability turns non-significant once justification is factored in, but truth doesn't really play a role. For robots, however, we also have complete mediation of the relationship between scenario and assertability. But in this case, not only justification is a significant mediator, but truth too. Okay, this suggests that the norm of assertion is structured differently for robots than for human beings, and it's the kind of thing. I mean, this is sort of a fancy way of showing the same thing we looked at with the bar charts. So this is sort of the conclusion. Warranted human assertion requires justified belief. It doesn't require truth. It certainly doesn't require knowledge. Less, however, is not sufficient. We do want good reasons on behalf of the speaker for what they say. Warranted robot assertion, however, requires justified belief and truth. Okay, so the norm of assertion for robots is more demanding. I've only shown you 2 experiments, but I've run 5 different ones with over 2,000 different people, and the results are relatively robust. I think this is it.
Thank you very much. This was very interesting, and now we hear a comment by Alex Wiegmann.
Okay, I will also share my screen. Yeah, thanks, Markus. Thanks a lot for this very, very interesting talk, and I guess also like very relevant topic in the future, and yeah, maybe perhaps also in the very near future. Normally, this would be the time to come up with some objections and demonstrate a few problems. But honestly, I have to say, I find the experiments and the results and also the interpretations quite convincing. Yeah, so first we have the finding that for humans, the norm of assertion seems to be justified belief. Markus presented strong evidence for this claim. This is not the predominant view in the philosophical literature. There, the knowledge norm is more popular, so to say. But the justified belief view seems, at least to me, quite plausible. And in the following, I will explore this view a little bit more and then pose a question that I think is kind of raised by the findings that Markus presented in his talk. So the justified belief view seems to fit nicely with findings about a somewhat related topic, namely the concept of lying. To illustrate this, let us consider a modified version of one of the scenarios that Markus employed in his studies. So again, the airport help desk is staffed by Ken. A woman asks Ken at which gate the flight to Paris leaves. Ken checks the database and sees that the flight leaves from gate 7. So now we have 2 versions of the story. In the one that I coined honest mistake, here Ken wants to help the woman. He says that the flight leaves from gate 7. However, the database is malfunctioning and the flight actually leaves from gate 99. In the other condition called failed deception, Ken wants to deceive the woman. So he says that the flight leaves from gate 99. However, again, the database is malfunctioning and the flight actually leaves from gate 99. So, and now the question is, did Ken lie? For cases with a structure like honest mistakes, it has been found in several empirical studies that almost all people don't consider the speaker to be lying, although what he said was false. By contrast, cases like failed deception are usually considered to be cases of lying, although what the speaker said is factually true. And to summarize these results, one could say that subjectivity, so what the speaker believes to be true or false, is crucial, while objectivity, in the sense of how things are actually in the world, is not that important. And this dominance of subjectivity over objectivity is also kind of found in Markus' studies about the norm of assertion. The speaker beliefs are centrally important, but not so much whether they are true or whether they're actually true or false. Yeah, and now one might wonder, if we assume that the aim of communication is the exchange of true information, one might ask, why doesn't objectivity play a more important role for the norm of assertion, or also for the concept of lying? And I think, like, first, subjective norms promote the truth, actually promote the truth. So, for example, uttering only justified beliefs will lead to almost all information that is being exchanged to be true. And also following subjective norms is like kind of quite easy. It's trivial to avoid lying if only beliefs matter. Just don't say anything you believe to be false. And it's also rather easy to follow the norm of assertion if the norm is justified belief. By contrast, it's not so easy to follow objective norms, such as a knowledge norm. So people just make mistakes and say false things. So perhaps like trying to strictly follow the knowledge norm or avoid lying in an objective sense by both by not saying something false might be too demanding and might decrease the exchange of information to such a degree that it does more harm than good. And furthermore, objective norms or an objective notion of lying might be kind of frustrating. So sometimes external factors that are beyond our control, such as in the example, the malfunctioning database, can cause us to say something false. And it seems a bit unfair that such factors can decide whether we comply or violate a social role, or whether or not we did lie. So it might be that although on first sight an objective norm seems to be more straightforward way to achieve the aim of exchanging true informations, a subjective norm might be actually a better means to promote this goal, because it takes into account like psychological considerations. And this line of reasoning might also play a role for the finding that the norm of assertion seems to be stricter for robots than for humans, because we don't have to take into account human psychology when thinking about norm for robots. There is no desire to exchange informations, and robots don't get frustrated like humans. So here, an objective norm might be the best way to go. One thing that I noticed during the talk was that assertability ratings differ to quite some extent between different cover stories, although the overall pattern was always the same. So if I remember correctly, the ratings for true unjustified beliefs were sometimes close to the lower end of the scale, and sometimes almost near the middle of the scale. And that made me wonder how general a norm of assertion is. So while it seems obvious that, for example, lying violates the norm of assertion, there might be contexts in which it's at least overall, okay to do so. So for instance, if a job candidate is asked whether she plans to get pregnant, or an aggressive ex-partner is asking whether there's a new partner, it seems in a sense fine to lie. And the question now is whether in such context, the norm of assertion is still violated, and it's just that other factors overshadow the norm of assertion, or another possibility, whether there are certain contexts where a different norm, or perhaps no norm at all, apply. And perhaps you have some thoughts about this question, and perhaps also about whether it would be worth to conduct studies where one tests different kind of contexts, and in particular such special context that I mentioned that I just mentioned. So thanks again for the invitation, Manfred, and thanks a lot, Markus, for this very, very interesting talk.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we give Markus some time to reply directly to your comments.
Good stuff. Thanks so much for these interesting comments, Alex. So I don't have a good explanation of why the what explains the fact that the norm of assertion is more demanding for robots or artificial agents, if you want, than for human agents. And I like Alex's suggestion, which I'll just repeat here and sort of develop a tiny bit. So Alex says, look, if we make a rule now for humans, it must be the case that we can fulfill the rule. Otherwise, I mean, the rule is a little bit idiotic now. Now, if it depends to a certain extent on luck, say we have really good reason to say that P, but it so happens the post office was always in Church Street, and this very morning, it moved to Victoria Avenue, okay, then it seems to be unfair to make a reproach on the basis of this unlucky incident. So as I understand Alex, when he says, you know, our human norms of assertion take into account subjective factors like, you know, what you believe and why you believe it, more than objective or external factors, then I think that makes a lot of luck, and it sort of dovetails with other debates concerning, for instance, epistemic and moral luck. Okay, we want things that inspire norms or rules to be under control. Otherwise, it seems to be unjust to say, look, you made this inadequate move that violates the rule, but in fact, you couldn't actually know it was beyond your control. It was just bad luck. For robots, Alex says these external factors play more of a role. And perhaps if we follow up this train of thought, we can say, well, you know, to a certain extent, robots then are subject to luck, or to epistemic luck, if you want. But we are not, because we design them. Okay, so we still have a lot of control. I mean, robots, even artificially intelligent, like basically artificial intelligence, is just like complex regression analysis. So we have considerable impact on how these things are designed, you know. So it makes sense to have a more rigorous standard or more demanding standard, because this whole issue of epistemic luck is less pertinent, you know? So I like that a lot. Then Alex pointed to this like interesting divergence whenever I give a talk of this sort of, when I collect new data. I also notice that there seems to be this difference across scenarios, what is and is not assertable. And I'll quickly share my screen again. What could be considered like a bit of an inconsistency in the findings, okay? Okay, these are the yes/no response mechanisms. Okay, this is the Ken at the airport scenario. We said justified true belief, everyone says it's assertable. Unjustified true belief, everyone says it's not assertable, okay, at all. And then for justified false belief, we sort of have 3 in 4 people saying that it is assertable, okay? Now contrast this with the other situation, the Dobmoth tourist office, where we have something like this on a Likert scale, okay? Even for the unjustified true belief situation, which should be unassertable, okay, for the human, presumably also for the robot, we are still significantly above the midpoint, okay? Why is that? Is it a matter of the scenario, or is it a matter of the response mechanism? So Alex's suggestion was, look, when you ask for moves in a language game, you know, whether they are in conformity with a norm or not, then there's all sorts of possible normative confounds. You know? So he mentioned an abusive relationship or a job interview, or you could like just point to specific situations where we make norms of assertion explicit, such as, for instance, US criminal courts, where you have to swear in the beginning that you state the truth, only the truth and nothing but the truth. Okay, so I do think context matters, but here in these scenarios, the context is very similar, and there is no abusive husband. There is no more, like, the good intention is sort of is rather salient and everything. So I think there is something else about the Likert methodology where people are extremely permissive, and they are much less permissive as regards possible norm violations when it comes to yes/no response mechanisms. So is this an explanation? No. This is just an observation. So I think the methodology here does play a big role. Why does it do that? I don't really know, But this is sort of maybe this just reinforces the importance of Alex's observation, but I don't have a, not only do I have a plausible, I don't have a convincing response to this interesting question.
Yeah, thank you very much.